This is 50 megalithic structures that proved history is wrong. Number 1. Göbekli Tepe. A Kurdish shepherd was walking the limestone hills outside Şanlıurfa in the fall of 1994, and his foot caught the top of a stone slab poking up through the dirt. The slab had a clean edge to it, too straight to be a rock that just landed there. He'd seen the same shape before on other rises across this stretch of southeastern Turkey, and most people around here treated those stones as field clutter, the kind of thing you plow around and forget. So the stones sat there for a long time before anyone looked twice. This is Göbekli Tepe, and the buried rings under that hill were carved around 9,500 BC, which makes them older than pottery, older than metal, older than the wheel. Before any of that gets interesting, you have to understand what the experts already thought they knew. Back in 1963, a joint survey team from the University of Chicago and Istanbul University walked this exact mound. They found broken limestone and some flint tools scattered across the top, wrote it down as a probable medieval cemetery, and moved on. The theory of human history at the time was clean and settled. First, people learned to farm, so they settled down in one place, so they had extra food and extra time, and only then, once the barns were full, did they get around to building temples and carving gods. Farming came first, religion came after. That was the order. Everybody agreed on the order. A German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt showed up at the mound in 1994, and he'd read that old Chicago survey. He walked the same hill the earlier team had dismissed, and he looked at the same broken stone tops sticking out of the ground. Where the 1963 crew saw grave markers, Schmidt saw the caps of enormous carved pillars still buried up to their necks in the earth. He said later that within the first minute, he understood he had two choices: walk away and say nothing, or spend the rest of his life digging here. He stayed. What his teams pulled out of that hill over the following years broke the order apart. Under the soil sat rings of massive T-shaped pillars, some of them over 5 meters tall and weighing around 10 tons each, standing in circles with two even bigger pillars planted in the center. Ground-penetrating radar suggested around 20 of these enclosures buried across the hill, and after decades of work, only a handful have been dug out. So most of Göbekli Tepe is still underground right now, sitting exactly where it's sat for 11,000 years. The pillars weren't blank either. Their surfaces crawl with animals carved in relief, foxes mid-stride, scorpions with their tails up, vultures, wild boars, snakes pouring down the stone in rows. All of it cut into hard limestone with nothing but flint tools because metal didn't exist yet for these people to use. Some pillars have arms carved down their sides and hands wrapping around toward a carved belt, which turns the whole T-shape into a kind of towering stone figure watching over the ring. And the people who made all this had no farms. The bones scattered through the site come from wild gazelle, wild boar, wild birds, the diet of hunters who followed herds rather than fenced them. The plant remains are wild grasses, not the plump domesticated wheat you'd get from a farming village. So the crews that quarried these pillars, carved the vultures, and hauled 10-ton stones into standing circles were doing it while still living off the hunt. The temple came first. The barns came later. You can still see how close they came to the edge of what was possible. The quarry sits a few hundred meters from the enclosures, and one pillar is still lying in the bedrock where it was being cut, around 7 meters long, cracked partway through and abandoned right there in the stone. Whoever was shaping it hit a flaw and left it, and it's been lying in that quarry ever since. The strangest part came at the end of these rings' lives. The people who built the enclosures took dirt, rubble, and animal bone and deliberately packed each ring full, burying their own temple on purpose. That backfilling is the reason the pillars survived at all, sealed and protected under the mound instead of weathering away in open air. And around the einkorn wheat growing wild in the hills nearby, geneticists traced the origin of domesticated wheat to this exact region, dated to a window just after these rings were raised. Klaus Schmidt dug here for about 20 years, arguing the whole time that the temple built the village and not the other way around. He died in 2014, before more than a fraction of his 20 buried rings had ever seen daylight. Number 2. Stonehenge. Fog sits low over Salisbury Plain most mornings, and out of it rise the sarsen stones, the tall gray uprights capped with horizontal slabs balanced across their tops. Sheep graze around the base of them. Cars slow on the A303 as it curves past, and for most of recorded history, nobody walking up to these stones had any real idea who set them there or why. This is Stonehenge, and the smaller blue stones in its inner ring were dragged to this plain from a range of hills roughly 240 kilometers away in Wales. For a long time, the explanations were guesses dressed up as history. Back in the 12th century, a cleric named Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote that the wizard Merlin had magicked the stones over from Ireland, and that version stuck around in books for centuries because nobody had anything better. In 1620, the Duke of Buckingham heard there might be treasure under the monument, so he sent men to dig a pit right under the center of it. They found no gold. What they left behind was a hole under the altar stone, and the start of a long habit of people carving into Stonehenge to see what was inside. The stones themselves come in two very different sizes, and that split is the whole mystery. The big ones, the sarsens, are local sandstone hauled from about 25 kilometers north. The smaller ones, the bluestones, are a different rock entirely, and geologists trace them to the Preseli Hills in southwest Wales by matching their exact mineral fingerprint to specific rocky outcrops there. So somebody quarried stones weighing 2 to 4 tons each and moved them the length of a small country around 5,000 years ago, using sledges, ropes, and human muscle. And in 2015, a team led by Mike Parker Pearson found something at a spot in Wales called Wan Mon. Sitting in the Preseli Hills was the outline of a dismantled stone circle, and several of its empty sockets were shaped to hold stones with cross-sections matching the Stonehenge bluestones. One socket even held rock chips of the same type. The working idea that came out of that dig is that a Welsh circle was taken apart and carried east, so Stonehenge may be a second-hand monument, rebuilt on the plain from stones that once stood somewhere else. The people who raised it were also woodworkers who forgot they were working in stone. The lintels across the top of the sarsens are held on with mortise and tenon joints, a bump carved on the upright fitting into a hollow carved in the lintel, the exact joint a carpenter uses to fix a beam to a post. And each curved lintel was shaped to follow the arc of the circle, so the top ring would have run smooth and continuous rather than flat and segmented. They cut furniture joints into 25-ton blocks. Before any of the standing stones went up, the site was a graveyard. Ringing the monument is a set of 56 pits called the Aubrey Holes, dug in an early phase, and cremated human bone was buried in and around them. Estimates put the number of people cremated and buried here in the hundreds, which makes Stonehenge one of the largest known burial grounds of its period in Britain. For centuries, the assumption was that Stonehenge went up in one go, one grand act of construction. The excavations took that apart. The monument was built and rebuilt across at least 5 phases, stretching over roughly 1,500 years, starting as a simple ditch and bank around 3000 BC, with the bluestones and sarsens arriving and being rearranged over many generations. So the people who dug the first ditch died more than 1,000 years before the people who set the last stone. How anyone knows, the dates comes down to what the builders threw away. Down in the ditch, archaeologists found antler picks, the red deer antlers the workers used like pickaxes to break up the chalk, and those antlers were left lying in the bottom of the trench when the digging was done. Radiocarbon dating on the antler gives the age of the tool, and the tool gives the age of the ditch, so the whole timeline of Stonehenge rests partly on a pile of shed deer antler, abandoned in a chalk trench 5,000 years ago. Number 3, the Great Pyramid of Giza. In 1798, a group of French scholars stood at the base of the Great Pyramid with surveying chains stretched across the sand, trying to measure a structure that had already been ancient when Julius Caesar was born. Napoleon had brought them along with his army, a whole caravan of mathematicians and engineers and artists sent to document Egypt. They ran their chains along the base and came up with numbers that didn't seem to make sense for anything human hands had built, and they left more puzzled than when they arrived. This is the Great Pyramid of Giza, built around 2560 BC, and its base sits level across roughly 13 acres to within a couple of centimeters. For about 2,000 years, the story of who built it came mostly from one Greek tourist. The historian Herodotus visited Egypt around 450 BC, listened to whatever the local guides told him, and wrote that 100,000 slaves had been whipped into hauling the stones. That number and that image, gangs of enslaved people dying under the lash, became the default picture in the Western imagination, repeated in books and paintings and later in Hollywood, right up through the 20th century. It was a good story. It was also more or less wrong. Two archaeologists, Mark Lehner and Zahi Hawass, spent years digging into the sand just south of the pyramids at a site called Hayt el Ghurab. What they pulled up out of the ground was a town. There were bakeries with rows of bread molds, breweries, and heaps of cattle and sheep bone, enough animal bone to suggest thousands of workers eating meat regularly, which is not how you feed people you're working to death. There were sleeping barracks, and close by, cemeteries where these workers were buried in a place of honor near the king's monument, some of their skeletons showing healed bones, meaning they'd been treated and cared for after injuries. So the men who moved the stones were paid laborers and skilled crews, fed on bread, beer, and beef, rotating in from villages across Egypt. And in 2013, a French team excavating at Wadi al-Jarf, an old harbor on the Red Sea, found the oldest inscribed papyrus ever discovered in Egypt. It was the logbook of a man named Merer, a middle-ranking official who ran a team of about 40 workers. Merer wrote down his days like a shipping manifest, and his logbook describes hauling limestone blocks by boat from the quarries at Tura, across the Nile, to the pyramid construction site. Here's how that worked. The fine white limestone that once cased the outside of the pyramid, giving it a smooth, gleaming skin, came from Tura, a quarry on the opposite bank of the Nile. Merer's crew loaded the blocks onto wooden boats and rode the river current, and a network of canals dug right up toward the base of the plateau, so the stone traveled most of its journey floating rather than dragged. Think of it less as men straining ropes across open desert, and more as a barge service, running blocks downstream on a schedule. Merer even logged his round trips, counting the days each delivery took. The people who built it left their own names inside, deep in the relieving chambers above the king's chamber, in spaces sealed off, and never meant to be seen again. The work gangs painted their crew names in red ochre, things like the Friends of Khufu and the Drunkards of Menkaure. Those painted gang tags, tucked in the dark above the burial chamber, are part of how we know the pyramid belongs to the pharaoh Khufu at all. The inside of the pyramid still holds spaces nobody has entered. In 2017, a project called Scan Pyramids used muon detection to look through the stone. Muons are tiny particles that rain down from the sky constantly and pass through solid rock. And by placing detectors inside the pyramid and counting how many muons came through from each direction, the team could map empty space the same way a doctor reads density on an X-ray, more particles passing through where there's a void. Their detectors picked up a large empty gap sitting above the Grand Gallery, at least 30 meters long. Then in 2023, the same kind of scanning confirmed another hidden corridor, this one tucked behind the chevron-shaped blocks over the pyramid's original entrance, about 9 meters long and sealed off since construction. A tiny endoscope camera, threaded through a narrow joint between the stones, finally looked inside that corridor and sent back the first images of a passage that had sat empty and dark for around 4,500 years. And Merer, the foreman who wrote it all down, logged the last stretch of the Great Pyramid's construction in his own hand, counting his boat trips, as he ferried the casing stones across the river, closing out his logbook on deliveries to a monument he was helping finish. Number 4. Nan Madol, off the eastern shore of Pohnpei, a small island in the middle of the Pacific. There's a stretch of shallow reef where basalt logs lie stacked on top of each other like cordwood left out to season. The stones are long and six-sided, gray-black, and they're piled into walls that rise straight out of the lagoon water, some of them standing several meters tall. Channels of seawater run between the walls, so a person moving through the ruins does it by canoe, paddling down flooded lanes with stone rising on either side. This is Nan Madol, a city of around 92 artificial islets built on a coral reef, laced together by canals instead of streets. The people who built it were the Saudalur, a dynasty that ruled Pohnpei for centuries before European ships ever came near. Pohnpei sits alone in the western Pacific, a green volcanic island ringed by reef, and the local oral history tells of two brothers, Olasipa and Olasohpa, who arrived and set out to build a place to worship the gods. So the islanders remember the founding as a two-man project, which, given what they built, was optimistic. The building material was already there in a sense, because Pohnpei is volcanic, and when certain lava flows cool slowly, they crack into long six-sided columns, the same natural process that made the Giant's Causeway in Ireland. Nature does the shaping. The columns split off in these neat, prismatic logs, and the builders quarried them from outcrops on the far side of the island, then had to get them across open water to the reef. That's the part still argued over. The columns are heavy, some of the individual stones weighing around 50 tons, and moving a 50-ton basalt log across a Pacific island and out onto a reef is a serious problem with no metal tools and no draft animals. The leading idea is that the builders lashed the columns to rafts and floated them, letting the water carry the weight the way it carried the casing stones of the pyramids, then slid them off at the site. Nobody has fully reconstructed how the largest ones were lifted into the upper courses of the walls, and experiments rafting replica stones have given a rough sense of the effort without settling the question. Once the columns reached the reef, the builders stacked them in a crosshatch pattern, one layer running one direction, and the next layer crossing it, the way you'd lay a log cabin, and filled the boxes they made with coral rubble to build up each islet above the waterline. So the whole city sits on around 100 of these coral and stone platforms, raised out of the lagoon by hand. For a long time, nobody could say how old any of it was, because coral and basalt don't carry dates on their surface. In 2016, a team used uranium-thorium dating on coral pulled from one of the tombs, a method that works by measuring how much uranium in the coral has slowly decayed into thorium, which acts like a clock, ticking from the moment the coral was placed. Those coral dates pushed the construction of the monumental tombs back earlier than many had assumed, placing major building activity around the early 2nd millennium AD, and marking Nan Madol as one of the earliest centers of its kind in the Pacific. The largest islet, a walled compound called Nandawas, holds a royal tomb ringed by walls that rise up to around 7 or 8 meters, built from those stacked basalt logs with a central vault of coral inside. The site carries 2 designations at once. In 2016, UNESCO added Nan Madol to its list of World Heritage Sites, and in the same breath placed it on the list of World Heritage in danger because the mangroves are prying the walls apart and the sea is slowly working the coral loose. Number 5. Puma Punku, high on the Bolivian Altiplano, at about 3,850 meters above sea level. There's a field of gray stone blocks lying scattered across the ground like the contents of a dropped toy box. Some of them are carved into a shape people call the H block, a flat slab cut with recessed steps and notches that repeat across its face with the evenness of something stamped by a machine. The wind up there is thin and cold, the grass is short and yellow, and the blocks lie tumbled and broken, some flipped on their backs, some half buried, all of them cut with edges sharp enough to run a fingernail along. This is Puma Punku, part of the ancient city of Tiwanaku, built somewhere around 500 to 600 AD. For a long time, people talked about Puma Punku as if it stood alone in the empty highland, a mystery dropped from nowhere. Tiwanaku was a city, the center of a state that ruled a big chunk of the southern Andes for centuries before the Inca ever rose, home to tens of thousands of people, with pyramids, sunken courtyards, and carved gateways spread across the plain. Pumapunku was one temple complex inside that city, a raised platform mound with terraces and a big ceremonial court on top. The stones come in two very different kinds, and telling them apart explains a lot. The huge platform slabs, some weighing well over 100 tons, are red sandstone, and geologists trace them to a quarry around 10 kilometers away. The smaller, finely carved pieces, the H blocks, and the precise little channels are andesite, a harder volcanic rock, hauled from a different quarry further off near Lake Titicaca. So two separate stone sources fed two separate jobs, the soft sandstone for the big flat foundations and the hard andesite for the fine detail work. The andesite pieces are what get argued about because the cuts in them are so clean. Many of the blocks are modular, meaning the same shapes and measurements repeat from block to block, so a given notch on one stone matches the notch on the next, the way flat-pack furniture comes with parts milled to fit a slot. That repetition suggests the builders worked from a set template, cutting to standard sizes so pieces could lock together on site. Inside some blocks, there are small drilled holes spaced in a line and interior right angles cut so crisp that people have argued for years about what tools made them, with the mainstream answer being harder hammer stones, grinding with sand, and a lot of patient labor rather than power tools. The blocks were also pinned together with metal. In the joints between certain stones, the builders carved matching keyhole-shaped slots, then poured molten metal into them, so it hardened into an eye-shaped clamp, bridging the two blocks, locking them like a staple across a seam. A researcher named Heather Lechtman studied these cramps and found they were made of arsenical bronze, and some appear to have been poured in place, meaning the builders ran a portable furnace right there at the wall and cast the metal directly into the stone. For a long time, the reconstruction was guesswork because the site is a scramble of loose blocks with no clear plan. An archaeologist named Alexander Vranich took the scattered stones, had them measured and modeled, then in 2018 printed small 3D replicas of the known blocks so they could be arranged and rearranged on a table like a puzzle, trying to rebuild the vanished temple in miniature. A lot of the damage came later and came from people. After the Spanish arrived, colonial crews quarried Tiwanaku for building stone, and in the modern era blocks were carted off, some broken up and used as ballast under railway tracks laid across the Altiplano. So part of why Pumapunku looks like a bomb went off is that treasure hunters, church builders, and railway engineers all took their turn at it, and out at the quarry, in the andesite source near the lake, a few blocks still lie, where they were left mid-shaping, cut partway into the same modular forms, and never hauled the last stretch to the temple. Number 6, Baalbek. In a quarry on the edge of the town of Baalbek in eastern Lebanon, there's a single carved limestone block lying at an angle in the ground, still attached at one end to the bedrock it was cut from. Local people gave it a name, the Stone of the Pregnant Woman. It's enormous, longer than a bus, and weighing something in the range of 1,000 tons, and it sits half-tilted in the dirt, where the ancient carvers left it, one corner still fused to the hillside because it was never fully freed. This is Baalbek, known to the Romans as Heliopolis, and up on the terrace above that quarry stands a temple platform built from some of the largest cut stones ever moved by human hands. The Romans built big here for a reason. Heliopolis was a major religious center in the Roman East, and they raised a colossal temple of Jupiter on the site, the kind of project emperors funded to show off the reach of Rome in a far corner of the empire. Roman engineering was the best in the ancient world, with cranes, pulleys, and armies of workers, and Baalbek is where they seem to have decided to find out how far that could be pushed. The answer was pretty far. The part that draws people is a section of the temple's foundation wall called the Trilithon, 3 limestone blocks laid end to end high up in the podium. Each of these three blocks weighs somewhere around 800 tons, and they were quarried, moved, and lifted into a course several meters off the ground, fitted so tightly against each other that the seams are hard to slide a blade into. Moving an 800-ton block with Roman equipment is a problem of multiplying muscle. The way a block and tackle lets one arm lift what 100 arms couldn't. So the crews would have used capstans, levers, and huge timber sledges hauled by hundreds of men in coordinated teams. The quarry down the hill holds the blocks that never made the trip, and they're even bigger than the ones in the wall. The stone of the pregnant woman is one, and a German archaeological team digging in the quarry in 2014 found another block underneath and beside it that was larger still, estimated at around 1,650 tons, which would make it one of the biggest worked stones known anywhere. It sits buried in the quarry floor, cut on its sides, waiting on a delivery that never came. There's an older question sitting under the Roman temple, literally. Some researchers have argued that the giant platform predates the Romans, that Rome built its temple on top of a much older base laid by an earlier culture. The excavations under the courtyard have turned up earlier layers of occupation going back thousands of years, but the trilithon stones themselves line up with Roman construction techniques and Roman-era material. So the mainstream reading is that the great blocks are Roman work, sitting above much older settlement debris. The debate runs on, and parts of the deep foundation remain hard to date. Up top, 6 columns of the Temple of Jupiter still stand, tall and fluted, holding a stretch of carved entablature against the sky, and they're all that's left upright of a colonnade that originally ran to 54 columns around the building. And down in the quarry, the 1,650-ton block the German team uncovered lies exactly where its carvers stopped, cut free on every side but the bottom, never lifted, never moved. Number 7. Newgrange. On the morning of December 21st, the shortest day of the year, a small crowd gathers in the dark inside a stone chamber in Ireland's Boyne Valley and waits. For most of the year, the inner room sits in total black, buried deep under a grassy mound. But on the winter solstice, as the sun clears the horizon outside, a thin blade of light slides through a slot above the entrance, creeps down a 19-meter passage of standing stones, and reaches the back wall of the chamber, lighting the floor gold for about 17 minutes before fading out. This is Newgrange, a passage tomb built around 3,200 BC, older than the pyramids at Giza, and older than Stonehenge. The people who built it left no writing, so most of what we know comes from the stones themselves and from careful digging. It sits on a bend in the River Boyne, a great flattened dome of earth and stone, about 85 meters across, ringed at its base by a curb of large slabs laid end to end. Farmers worked the land over it for centuries with no idea what sat underneath, and the passage was found again by accident in 1699, when a local landowner sent workmen to cart away stone for a road, and they broke into the entrance. The mound is held up by a technique called a corbelled roof, and it's the reason the chamber has stayed dry for 5,000 years. Instead of a single slab across the top, the builders stacked flat stones in rings, each layer nudged slightly inward over the one below, until the walls leaned in far enough to be capped by one stone at the peak, the way you might close a dome by leaning bricks toward each other until they meet. Each stone was tilted so rainwater runs outward, off the roof and away from the room, so the inner chamber has never flooded. Water still runs off it today. The front of the mound is faced with brilliant white quartz, and that facade caused an argument that hasn't fully died down. When the archaeologist Michael O'Kelly excavated the site in the 1960s and 70s, he found a mass of white quartz cobbles collapsed around the entrance, and he chose to reconstruct them as a steep vertical wall of gleaming stone above the doorway. Some archaeologists agree with that reading, and others think the quartz originally lay flat on the ground as a kind of shining plaza. So the bright wall you see in photos today is O'Kelly's best guess rather than a certainty. At the base of the entrance sits one of the most worked stones on the site, Curbstone 1, carved edge to edge with a design of triple spirals, three coils wound together and cut into the rock with stone tools, the same spiral motif that turns up deeper inside the tomb. The slot that lets the solstice light in is a deliberate piece of engineering, a separate opening above the main doorway that archaeologists call the roof box, and it's aligned so precisely that the sunbeam only enters for a handful of days around midwinter. O'Kelly was the first person in modern times to sit inside the chamber at dawn on the solstice and watch it happen in 1967, confirming that the alignment still worked after 5,000 years. Inside the chamber, in stone basins set into three side recesses, his team found the burnt bones of the dead, cremated remains placed in the deepest part of the tomb where the light reaches. So many people now want to stand in that chamber for the solstice sunrise that places inside are handed out by an annual lottery. A handful of names drawn from tens of thousands of entries for the chance to watch the light come down the passage. Number 8. Sacsayhuaman. On a hill above the old Inca capital of Cusco in the Peruvian Andes, there's a wall that runs in a long zigzag across the slope, built from gray limestone blocks fitted so tightly together that a sheet of paper won't slide between them. One of the stones has 12 separate angles cut into its edges, each one matched to the block beside it, so the whole face locks together like puzzle pieces someone carved to order. The blocks are huge, some of them taller than a person, and they've held their shape through earthquakes that flattened the Spanish buildings, put up centuries later. This is Sacsayhuaman, a walled complex above Cusco built by the Inca, with some of its terrace stones weighing over 100 tons. The Inca ran the largest empire in the Americas, and much of the grand stonework at Cusco went up under a ruler named Pachacuti in the 15th century, the emperor who rebuilt the capital as the center of his state. When the Spanish arrived, chroniclers like Pedro Cieza de Leon and Garcilaso de la Vega wrote down what they saw, and they described the walls of Sacsayhuaman with something close to disbelief. Unable to work out how stones that size were shaped and stacked without iron tools or wheels. Garcilaso, who grew up in Cusco, said the locals of his day couldn't explain it either. The building method is called polygonal masonry, and it explains the tight seams. Instead of squaring every block into a neat rectangle, the masons shaped each stone to fit the specific stones around it, cutting curved and many-angled faces so each block settled into its neighbors like a molar into a jaw. Little bumps, called bosses, were left on some faces, and there are protrusions and channels that may have been used to lever and rock the stones into position. The masons grinding a block, test-fitting it, lifting it out, and grinding again until the join was flush. It was slow, patient work, closer to fitting joinery than laying bricks. The largest blocks sit in the great terraces, some estimated at well over 100 tons, hauled from quarries kilometers away and dragged up to the site by teams of workers using ropes, ramps, and rollers. The walls saw real fighting. In 1536, during the rebellion against the Spanish, the Inca leader Manco Inca and his forces seized Sacsayhuaman and used it as a stronghold to lay siege to the Spanish holdup in Cusco below, the two sides trading attacks across the terraces before the Spanish finally stormed and took the complex. After the conquest, the site became a quarry. The Spanish pulled down the smaller, more manageable stones and carted them into Cusco to build churches and houses, including the cathedral on the main square. So much of the colonial city is made of recycled Inca masonry. They left the biggest blocks where they stood, the ones too heavy to move, which is why the surviving walls are made almost entirely of giants. And when earthquakes hit Cusco, the Spanish colonial walls, built on top, cracked and fell, while the Inca foundation, courses underneath, with their many angled blocks locked into each other, stayed standing. Number 9. Karnak stones. In the fields near a small town on the coast of Brittany in northwest France, there are rows of granite stones running across the landscape for kilometers. They stand in long parallel lines, thousands of them, some barely knee-high, and others taller than a person, marching over the low green hills in ranks like a crowd frozen mid-stride. A road cuts through them, cows graze between them, and the lines run on so far that from the ground you can't see where they end. This is Karnak, a set of megalithic alignments in Brittany made up of around 3,000 standing stones. The people who raised them were Neolithic farmers, living along the Breton coast thousands of years ago, working stone into the ground long before Rome, or even the pyramids. The stones are grouped into several main alignments, each with its own name: Menic, Kermario, and Kerleskin. And within each group, the rows run more or less parallel across the fields, sometimes fanning slightly, sometimes ending in a rough oval of stones called a cromlech. Nearby sits a structure called the Limanio Quadrilateral, a rectangle of stones that has been dated to help pin down when the whole complex was being built, placing much of the activity in the 5th millennium BC. An alignment is a different thing from a stone circle, and the distinction matters for what people argue about. A circle, like Stonehenge, closes back on itself. An alignment is a straight run of stones marching in a line, and because these lines point across the horizon, people have argued for a long time that they were laid out to track the sun or the moon siding along the rows toward a sunrise or a moonrise on certain days of the year. A Scottish engineer named Alexander Thom spent years in the mid-20th century surveying megalithic sites across Britain and Brittany, measuring the exact positions of stones to test whether they lined up with astronomical events. Thom argued that Karnak and sites like it encoded careful sky observations, and his surveys kicked off decades of statistical back and forth, with some researchers finding real alignments in the numbers, and others arguing the patterns were loose enough to be coincidence. The debate hasn't fully settled, and take the more elaborate astronomical claims with a grain of salt. At the western end of the complex, once stood the largest of them all, the Grand Menhir Brisé, a single standing stone that reached around 20 meters when whole. It lies on the ground now, broken into 4 huge pieces, and researchers still argue over whether it fell in an earthquake or was toppled by the people who raised it. Over the centuries, a lot of Karnak's stones vanished into the surrounding countryside, broken up for farm walls, road fill, and building stone by locals who had a field full of free granite and a use for it. The site is fenced off in places now, partly to protect it from erosion after so many feet wore down the ground between the rows. And of the stones that once stood at Karnak, thousands are gone, carted off one by one into the walls and roadbeds of the villages around them. Number 10, Gantija. On the small island of Gozo, just north of Malta in the middle of the Mediterranean, there are 2 stone temples standing side by side inside a single curving boundary wall. The walls are built from limestone blocks so large that they rise well above head height, some of them several meters tall, curving inward to form rounded chambers shaped a bit like clover leaves. The stones are pale and weathered, pocked by thousands of years of sea wind, and they stand on a low hill looking out over the terraced fields of Gozo. This is Gantija, a pair of temples on Gozo dated to around 3,600 BC, older than Stonehenge and older than the pyramids. The people who raised it were farmers of the Maltese temple period, a culture that built a whole run of these stone temples across Malta and Gozo over centuries, long before writing reached the islands. Gantija is one of the oldest of them, and the 2 temples sit within one outer wall. Each entered through a doorway that opens into a series of rounded rooms called apses, arranged along a central passage like beads on a string. The builders used 2 kinds of local limestone for 2 different jobs. The rough outer walls are coralline limestone, the harder, tougher stone, good for standing up to weather. The inner walls and finer details are Globigerina limestone, a softer stone, easier to carve and smooth, so the crews saved the workable material for the surfaces people would see and touch inside. Traces of plaster have been found on some interior walls, hinting that the rooms were once smoothed and finished rather than left as bare rock. The name comes from local folklore, from the Maltese word for giant, because people looking at blocks this size assumed no ordinary person could have lifted them, and told stories of a giantess who built the temples while carrying a child on her shoulder. How the blocks were moved is still worked out from what's left on the ground. Small stone spheres have been found around Maltese temple sites, and one idea is that the builders rolled the great blocks over these stone balls, like ball bearings under a heavy crate, easing multi-ton slabs across the ground with rollers rather than dragging them dead weight. It's a reasonable reading of the evidence, though the exact method stays a matter of informed guesswork. Guntaija stands as one of the earliest known freestanding stone structures anywhere, raised on a hilltop on Gozo while much of the world was still building in wood and mud. Number 11. Angkor Wat. In 1860, a French naturalist named Henri Mouhot pushed through the forest of Cambodia and came out in front of a set of stone towers rising above the trees, shaped like closed lotus buds, wrapped in vines and roots. He'd been collecting insects and plants, and he stumbled onto a temple so large and so finely carved that he could hardly believe the local people when they told him it had been built by their own ancestors. He wrote in his journal that it rivaled anything left by Greece or Rome, and his published account helped bring the place to wide attention in Europe. This is Angkor Wat, a temple in Cambodia built in the early 12th century under a king named Suryavarman II. Suryavarman ruled the Khmer Empire, a state that controlled much of mainland Southeast Asia, and he raised Angkor Wat as a temple to the Hindu god Vishnu, and, in time, his own tomb. The sandstone came from quarries at the base of a mountain called Phnom Kulen, roughly 40 kilometers away, and the blocks were floated to the site along a network of canals, so the stone rode the water most of the way, rather than being dragged overland. The temple sits inside a vast moat, a rectangle of water so wide it reads almost like a lake, framing the towers at its center. For a long time, people saw Angkor Wat as a lone temple sitting in the jungle, and the scale of the city around it stayed hidden under forest. In 2012, a team led by Damian Evans flew aircraft over the region firing lasers at the ground, a technique called LiDAR that measures how long the light takes to bounce back, building a map of the surface even through the tree canopy by catching the beams that slip between the leaves. The survey revealed a sprawling urban grid buried under the forest floor, roads, canals, ponds, and the outlines of neighborhoods, showing that Angkor was one of the largest cities of the pre-industrial world, a low-density sprawl fed by a huge engineered water system of reservoirs and channels. Around the temple's galleries run bas-reliefs carved into the sandstone, long panels of figures cut in shallow relief along the walls, including a famous scene of gods and demons pulling on a giant serpent to churn an ocean of milk, a Hindu creation story stretched across dozens of meters of stone. Over the centuries, the temple's use shifted from Hindu to Buddhist as the Khmer Kingdom's religion changed, and Buddha images were added, while some earlier Hindu carvings were altered or covered, so the walls carry the marks of both faiths layered on the same stone. And along one gallery wall, a stretch of the carving was never finished, the figures left as faint outlines and half-cut shapes where the Khmer sculptors set down their tools and stopped. Number 12. Callanish. On a windswept moor on the Isle of Lewis, out in the Outer Hebrides off the west coast of Scotland, tall, thin stones of pale banded rock stand in a rough cross shape against the gray sky. At the center rises one narrow monolith, taller than the rest, ringed by a circle of standing stones, with lines of more stones running out from the circle like the arms of a cross laid on the ground. The rock is Louisian gneiss, some of the oldest stone on Earth, streaked with dark and light bands, and the stones stand on open ground with the sea not far off. This is Callanish, a stone circle on the Isle of Lewis, and for centuries its lower portions sat buried under peat. The people who raised it were Neolithic islanders, working here around 5,000 years ago, in the same broad era as the great tombs of the Boyne Valley. The stones had stood for thousands of years when a thick blanket of peat, the spongy waterlogged plant matter that builds up slowly on Scottish moors, crept up around their bases and swallowed the lower parts of them. By the 19th century, the peat had risen about 1.5 meters up the stones, so the circle people saw was only the top half of the real thing. In 1857, the landowner had the peat cut away, and workers stripped off around 5 feet of built-up bog to reveal the full height of the stones and the buried ground surface around them. That peat depth is a rough clock in itself, because peat grows slowly over centuries, so 5 feet of it piling up against the stones is a measure of just how long they'd been standing before anyone dug them out. The layout is cruciform, a circle with a tall central pillar, and rows of stones reaching out in the rough shape of a cross, and people have long argued over whether the alignments track the moon. The southern rows point toward a range of low hills on the horizon, and during a rare event called a major lunar standstill, which happens every 18.6 years, the moon rises low and skims along those hills, so some researchers argue the site was placed to frame that moonrise. Take the more precise astronomical claims with some caution, since the debate isn't settled. At the center of the ring, tucked against the base of the tall pillar, sits a small chambered tomb, a burial structure added into the circle after the stones were already standing, so the monument was a graveyard as well as a ring. Scattered around the main circle are several smaller stone circles nearby, a whole cluster of them across the moor, making Callanish less a single monument than a landscape full of them. And the 5 feet of peat, cut away in 1857, stands as a plain measure of the years, the slow bog growth of millennia stripped off in a single season to uncover stones that had been sinking into the moor since before the pyramids. Number 13. Dolmen de Menga. Near the town of Antequera in southern Spain, there's a low mound of earth with a stone doorway cut into its side, and inside runs a corridor built of standing slabs holding up a roof of flat stone. At the far end sits a single capstone laid across the top, a slab so heavy that engineers put its weight around 150 tons, resting on the uprights that hold up the whole passage. The corridor is tall enough to walk into upright, and down its length stand a few stone pillars propping up that enormous roof. This is the Dolmen de Menga, a megalithic tomb near Antequera, dated to around 3800 BC. The people who built it were Neolithic communities in what's now Andalusia, working with local stone and a lot of coordinated muscle, thousands of years before Rome. A dolmen, at its simplest, is a stone table, upright slabs supporting a flat capstone over a chamber. Menga is a grand version of that idea, a corridor tomb where a run of paired uprights holds a line of roof slabs, and the whole thing was covered over with an earthen mound, so that from outside it reads as a hill with a stone mouth. The construction is post and lintel, the same basic idea as a doorway, uprights standing on either side, and a beam laid across the top. What makes Menga hard is the size of the beams. The capstones are massive, that final one around 150 tons, and to keep the long roof from sagging or cracking, the builders stood stone pillars down the center of the corridor, load-bearing columns holding the middle of each slab, the way a post in a basement holds up a floor joist. A 2023 engineering study looked at how the great uprights were fitted into the ground and found the slabs were set into carved sockets and wedged tightly, locking each stone in place through careful friction and counterweighting rather than mortar. Menga also points somewhere odd. Most tombs of this kind face the rising sun, but Menga's corridor is aligned toward a nearby mountain, a distinctive peak called the Peña de los Enamorados, that from a distance looks like a sleeping human face. So the builders oriented their tomb toward a landmark on the horizon rather than a point of sunrise. Inside the chamber in the 19th century, a deep well was found cut into the floor, a shaft going down into the ground within the tomb itself, and its purpose is still argued over. To raise the tomb, the builders quarried the slabs from a source roughly a kilometer away and hauled them across the ground and up a slope to the mound, dragging a 150-ton stone the last stretch to lay it across the top of the corridor. Number 14. Karahan Tepe. In the dry hills of southeastern Turkey, archaeologists cleared away the dirt from a chamber and found a room that had been carved straight down out of the bedrock itself. Pillars rose from the stone floor, but they hadn't been quarried elsewhere and stood up here. They'd been cut in place, shaped out of the living rock by carving away everything around them, so the whole room and its columns were one continuous piece of the hillside. And out of one wall, a human head projects from the stone, a face with a long neck, looking out across the room toward the pillars. This is Karahan Tepe, a stone site in southeastern Turkey dated to roughly the same era as Göbekli Tepe, around 9000 BC or earlier. It belongs to a whole cluster of sites archaeologists call the Taş Tepeler, the stone hills, spread across this region of Turkey, of which Göbekli Tepe was the first to be dug, and Karahan Tepe one of the most striking to follow. These were built by hunting and gathering people who had no farms and no pottery, working stone into ritual spaces thousands of years before the usual story says such things should exist. Excavations at Karahan Tepe began in earnest around 2019 under the direction of a Turkish archaeologist named Necmi Karul, and they opened up rooms that had sat buried for 11,000 years. The carving method is what sets it apart, because instead of hauling stones in and standing them up, the builders worked subtractively, the way a sculptor frees a figure from a block of marble by removing everything that isn't the figure. They started with solid bedrock and cut down and around, leaving pillars standing where they wanted them, and hollowing out the chamber floor between. So the pillars in that main room are not placed. They're what's left after everything around them was chiseled away. In that same room stand a series of tall pillars carved in a phallic form, rising in a row from the rock floor, and the human head juts from the wall at one end, its neck stretched out so the face seems to watch over the standing pillars, an arrangement people have read as some kind of ritual scene, though what it meant is guesswork. The dating places Karahan Tepe in the same deep window as Göbekli Tepe, among the oldest monumental sites known anywhere, built by people who were still hunting wild game across these hills. Across the region, the Taş Tepeler survey has identified a string of similar mounds, most of them never excavated, still sitting under the soil of southeastern Turkey waiting for someone to dig. Number 15. Ollantay Tambo. In the sacred valley of Peru, high above a river, there's a terrace where 6 enormous slabs of pink stone stand in a row, set edge to edge with thin strips of stone wedged between them. The slabs are tall, taller than a house, and they were meant to be one wall of a great temple that was never finished. Look across the valley from where they stand, and you can see the mountainside they came from, a quarry cut into the rock roughly 900 meters up the opposite slope, on the far side of a river. This is Ollantay Tambo, an Inca site in Peru where the temple stones were quarried from a mountain across the valley. The Inca built Ollantay Tambo as a temple and fortress complex, part of the estate of the Emperor Pachacuti in the 15th century, on a shoulder of rock above the town that still carries the same name and the same street plan today. The 6 pink slabs on the upper terrace are rhyolite, a volcanic stone, and they came from that quarry high on the other mountain, which means the builders had to bring multi-ton blocks down one slope, across the valley floor, over the river, and up to the temple site. You can still see the road they used. A long ramp runs down the quarry mountainside, a built causeway the Inca used to slide the stones down toward the valley, easing the huge blocks along a prepared surface rather than letting them tumble. To cross the river, the leading idea is that they diverted the water or built up the banks so the stones could be dragged across, then hauled up the far slope to the terrace by teams on ropes. Scattered along that route are blocks that never arrived, sitting in the fields and on the ramp between the quarry and the site, half-shaped stones abandoned mid-journey that locals came to call the piedras cansadas, the tired stones left where the work stopped. Ollantay Tambo also saw a battle. In 1537, during the Inca resistance against the Spanish, the leader Manco Inca fell back to Ollantay Tambo and used the high terraces as a stronghold. And when a Spanish force under Hernando Pizarro rode up to take it, the Inca flooded the plain below through channels they controlled, bogging down the horses in water and mud, and driving the Spanish back down the valley. The temple those 6 slabs were meant for was never completed. The Great Wall left standing as a row of finished stones, with the rest of the building never raised around them, and the tired stones still lie out on the ramp where their haulers set them down. Number 16. Avebury. In the English countryside of Wiltshire, there's a village where the houses, the pub, and the road all sit inside a giant ring of standing stones. A person can walk out their front door and lean against a sarsen boulder that's been standing there for thousands of years, or drive through a gap in a massive earthen bank on the way to buy milk. Sheep graze between the stones, and the whole circle is so large that it swallows the village whole. The modern buildings, tucked among the ancient uprights. This is Avebury, the largest megalithic stone circle in Britain, built around 2500 BC. The people who raised it dug an enormous henge first, a circular ditch and bank enclosing an area big enough to hold the later village, then set a great outer ring of sarsen stones inside it, with 2 smaller circles nested within. The scale is the whole point because Avebury is much bigger than Stonehenge, spread out rather than tightly built, so it reads less as a single monument and more as a landscape you walk through. The stones had a rough time in the Middle Ages. Local people, uneasy about the pagan monument or just wanting the land clear, dug pits and toppled many of the stones into them, burying the great sarsens in the ground. During one of these burials, a stone came down on a man as he worked beneath it and pinned him, and his skeleton was found centuries later crushed under the fallen stone, along with coins and tools that dated him to the early 1300s. People have called him the barber surgeon because of the items found with him. In the 1930s, a wealthy man named Alexander Keeler took an interest in the buried and broken circle. Keeler had made his money from the family marmalade business in Scotland, and he poured it into archaeology, buying up the land at Avebury, excavating the fallen stones, and re-erecting many of them in their original sockets. So a good part of what stands today was stood back up on marmalade money. Running southeast from the main circle is the West Kennet Avenue, a double row of standing stones that once formed a processional path leading toward another monument called the Sanctuary. So Avebury was linked by a stone-lined walk to the sites around it, and where stones had been destroyed and couldn't be replaced, Keeler marked their old positions with squat concrete pillars. So today the circle is a mix of real sarsens and concrete markers standing in for the stones that were smashed and carted away. Number 17. Hypogeum of Hal Saflieni. In 1902, a work crew on the island of Malta was cutting into the rock to sink cisterns for a row of new houses, and their tools broke through into a hollow space beneath the ground. They'd opened a hole into a chamber carved out of solid rock, dropping down into darkness below the street. The builders, more interested in finishing the houses than reporting the find, kept the discovery quiet for a while and worked around it before it came to the attention of archaeologists. This is the Hypogeum of Hal Saflieni, an underground complex cut down into the rock on Malta, holding the remains of around 7,000 people. The people who made it were the same Maltese temple builders who raised the stone temples above ground, working around 4,000 to 2,500 BC. Above ground, they built temples by stacking stone. Here they did the opposite, digging down and hollowing out chambers, so the Hypogeum is a temple carved into the earth rather than built on top of it. It runs 3 levels deep, a warren of rooms and passages cut by hand into the soft Globigerina limestone, spiraling down into the rock. The way they built it is subtractive architecture, which is the plain opposite of stacking blocks. Instead of adding stone to make walls, the workers removed stone to leave rooms behind, carving out the Kong spaces with stone tools and antler picks, shaping columns, doorways, and curved ceilings by cutting away everything that wasn't the room. In the lower chambers, they even carved the rock to imitate the above-ground temples, cutting fake doorways and beams into the walls, so the underground rooms echoed the buildings up in the daylight. One chamber has become known for its sound. A niche in one room, called the Oracle Room, produces a strange resonance, so a voice spoken into it at a certain pitch seems to fill the whole space and vibrate through the rock. And studies of the chamber's acoustics have measured how the cut of the walls amplifies low tones. On some of the ceilings, painted in red ochre, are curving spiral patterns, among the only prehistoric wall paintings on Malta, brushed onto the rock overhead in the chambers. The site suffered from how it was first dug. The early clearing of the hippodrome was done quickly and without careful recording, so bones and objects were pulled out in bulk before modern methods existed to map where everything lay, and a lot of information about the 7,000 dead was lost in that first rushed excavation. To protect the soft rock and its paintings from the breath and humidity of visitors, the number of people allowed inside each day is now strictly capped. A small handful of tickets released for a site that once held thousands of the dead. Number 18. Cahokia's Monk's Mound. Across the river from what's now St. Louis, in southern Illinois, there's a flat-topped hill of earth that rises in wide terraces above the surrounding plain. A person can climb a long staircase to the top and look out over farmland and highway, standing on a mound that covers around 14 acres at its base and climbs to roughly 30 meters. It's built entirely of earth, no stone at all, and it's the largest earthwork of its kind north of Mexico. This is Monk's Mound, the centerpiece of Cahokia, a Native American city that stood here around 1050 AD. The people who built Cahokia belonged to what archaeologists call the Mississippian culture. Farmers of corn who raised a whole city on the Mississippi floodplain with plazas, neighborhoods, and more than 100 earthen mounds, home, at its peak, to a population estimated in the tens of thousands, which for its time made it larger than London. Archaeologists talk about a moment around 1050 they call the Big Bang, when Cahokia seems to have grown very fast into a planned city, drawing people in from across the region. Monk's Mound was built basket by basket. The Mississippians had no wheelbarrows and no draft animals, so they carried the earth in woven baskets on their backs, tens of thousands of loads dug from borrow pits and dumped and packed layer by layer, building the mound up over decades. When archaeologists cut into it, they can read those layers like tree rings, different soils stacked in stages that show the mound rising in phases. The name comes from a group of French Trappist monks who lived nearby in the early 1800s and gardened on its terraces long after the original city was gone. Out on the plaza, the Cahokians also set up rings of tall wooden posts that worked as a solar calendar, marking sunrise positions across the year, a structure archaeologists nicknamed Woodhenge. In a smaller mound nearby, called Mound 72, excavators found a burial laid out on a bed of more than 20,000 shell beads arranged in the shape of a bird, along with the remains of many other people buried around it, some of them apparently sacrificed as part of the ceremony. The Great Mound has trouble holding its shape. Sections of Monk's Mound's flanks have slumped and slid in recent decades, the earth bulging and slipping after heavy rains, and crews have had to dig in and repair the slopes to keep the 14-acre pile of packed soil from sliding apart. Number 19. El Castillo. On the spring equinox, a crowd gathers at the foot of a stepped pyramid in the Yucatan jungle of Mexico and watches the late afternoon sun throw a shadow down one edge of the staircase. As the light shifts, the shadow breaks into a row of triangles running down the balustrade, and at the bottom of the stairs sits a carved stone snakehead, so the whole thing reads as a giant serpent of light and shadow slithering down the side of the pyramid. The crowd stays until the sun drops and the serpent fades. This is El Castillo, the Great Pyramid at Chichen Itza, built by the Maya over an older pyramid hidden inside it. The Maya raised Chichen Itza as a major city in the Yucatan, and El Castillo went up in the Maya Toltec period, a stepped pyramid dedicated to the feathered serpent deity Kukulkan. The builders did something common in Mesoamerica, which was to build a new pyramid right on top of an old one, like nesting one box inside a larger box. So El Castillo is really two pyramids, a smaller, earlier one swallowed by the bigger, later one. In the 1930s, archaeologists tunneled into the structure and found that inner temple, and inside it a stone throne carved as a jaguar, painted red with jade spots, along with a reclining stone figure called a chakmul. The pyramid is also a calendar you can climb. Each of its four faces has a staircase, and the steps and terraces add up in a way that tracks the days of the Maya year. So the building is a stone almanac, its architecture counting time the way a wall calendar counts it in squares. In 2015, researchers ran an electrical resistivity survey under the pyramid, sending current through the ground to map what lies below by how the earth conducts it, and they found a hidden sinkhole, a water-filled cave called a cenote, sitting directly beneath the base of El Castillo. The staircase does something with sound too. Clap your hands at the base of the great stairway, and the echo that bounces back off the steps comes back as a chirped, bird-like chirp, which acoustics researchers have linked to the even spacing of the stone risers scattering the sound. After a visitor fell to their death on the steep steps, the pyramid was closed to climbers, so the stairways that once carried people up to the temple now stand roped off, climbed only by the shadow serpent twice a year. Number 20, Rapa Nui's Ahu Tongariki. On the eastern shore of Rapa Nui, the island in the South Pacific most people call Easter Island, 15 giant stone figures stand in a row on a long stone platform, their backs to the sea, facing inland across the grass. They're moai, the island's famous carved heads and torsos, some of them several meters tall, weighing dozens of tons each, lined up shoulder to shoulder on a platform called an ahu. They gaze out over the island, away from the ocean, watching the land where the living once lived. This is Ahu Tongariki, the largest platform of standing moai on Rapa Nui. The people who carved them were the Rapa Nui, Polynesians who settled this remote island, and, over centuries, produced nearly 1,000 of these stone figures. The moai were quarried at a volcanic crater called Rano Raraku, where the soft volcanic rock was easy to carve, and the crater slopes are still dotted with moai in every stage of work, some barely blocked out, some finished and standing, some abandoned mid-carve. Ahu Tongariki's 15 figures had stood, then fallen. Then in 1960, a tsunami generated by a massive earthquake off Chile swept inland and scattered the toppled statues across the site, tossing multi-ton stone around like driftwood. The platform was rebuilt in the 1990s, and the restoration was helped along when a Japanese company donated a crane to lift the moai back onto the Ahu. So the row you see today was stood back up with modern machinery after the sea knocked it flat. How the Rapa Nui moved the moai from the quarry across the island has been argued over for decades. One idea, tested by researchers Carl Lipo and Terry Hunt, is that the statues were walked upright, rocked side to side with ropes, so they shuffled forward a step at a time, the way you'd move a heavy fridge by tilting and turning it corner over corner. They got a replica moai to walk down a road this way in an experiment, showing the method could work, though whether it's how every statue traveled remains open. Out at Rano Raraku, the moai that people picture as just heads are mostly buried up to the neck, and excavations in the 2000s dug down to reveal that many have full torsos and arms hidden under the soil, complete bodies swallowed by centuries of sediment. For a long time, the story of Rapa Nui was told as ecological suicide, a people who cut down every tree and collapsed. But researchers, including Lipo and Hunt, have argued the decline had more to do with rats eating seeds and the diseases and slave raids that came with European contact. So the simple morality tale has grown more complicated and stays debated. Up in the crater, one unfinished moai still lies on its back in the rock where it was being carved, around 21 meters long, a stone figure that was never cut free from the mountain. Number 21. Dolmens of the North Caucasus. In a forest in southern Russia, on the slopes running down toward the Black Sea, there are stone boxes standing among the trees. Each one is built of a few flat slabs, walls, and a roof, with a single round hole cut into the front face, a neat circular opening low enough that a person would have to crouch to reach it. Some sit alone in clearings, some in clusters, weathered and mossed over, and the round holes stare out of them like eye sockets. These are the dolmens of the North Caucasus, thousands of stone tombs built in the mountains of southern Russia from around 3000 BC onward. The people who built them lived in the Caucasus in the Bronze Age, and they left thousands of these structures scattered across the region between the mountains and the sea, though many have been lost. A dolmen here is a chamber made of large stone plates fitted together, walls, a floor, and a heavy capstone, and the signature feature is that round portal hole in the front slab, usually just wide enough to pass a body or reach an arm through, often found with a matching stone plug carved to fit it like a cork in a bottle. The joins are surprisingly precise. The corner slabs were often cut with grooves so that one plate slides into another. The edges shaped to lock together rather than just leaning, so the builders were fitting stone plates into stone plates the way you'd slot a drawer together before capping the box with a roof stone. Some of the dolmens weren't assembled from separate plates at all. A few were carved from a single block of rock, the builders hollowing out the chamber and cutting the portal hole into one solid stone, a whole tomb quarried out of one boulder. The dolmens suffered over the centuries. Many were looted long ago, their plug stones pulled out and their contents emptied, and through the Soviet era, a lot went unrecorded and unprotected, broken up or built over as the region developed. Of the thousands that once stood across the North Caucasus, only a fraction survive intact today. The rest known mostly from old records and the scattered slabs left where the boxes came apart. Number 22. Zorat's Karar. On a windswept plateau in southern Armenia, near the town of Sisian, there's a field of upright basalt stones standing in rough rings and rows across the grass. Dozens of them lean and stand at odd angles, gray and weathered, and some have a smooth, round hole bored clean through the upper part of the stone, a circular perforation you can put your eye to and look through toward the horizon. The wind comes across the high plateau. The stones cast long shadows, and those drilled holes catch the light. This is Zorat's Karar, a prehistoric stone site in Armenia, known locally by a name that translates roughly to Army of Stones. The people who raised these stones lived on the Armenian highlands in deep prehistory, and the dating of the site is genuinely disputed, with estimates ranging widely across thousands of years. So anyone giving you a single confident date is glossing over a real argument. The field holds around 200 standing basalt stones, arranged with a central cluster and arms of stones reaching out, and roughly 80 of them carry those bored holes near the top. The holes are what the fight is about. A physicist named Paris Harouni argued in the late 20th century that Zorat's Karar was an ancient observatory, that the drilled holes were sighting tubes lined up with the rising and setting of the sun and certain stars, making the site a kind of stone telescope for tracking the sky. He championed the idea strongly, even claiming the site was thousands of years older than Stonehenge. Archaeologists pushed back hard, arguing the holes could have had ordinary uses, like anchoring ropes or lashing the stones, and that the astronomical alignments were read into the site rather than built into it. That disagreement has never fully resolved. Within the stone field there are also tombs, burial cists set into the ground among the uprights, showing the place was used as a cemetery, whatever else it may have been. When archaeologists excavated at the site, what they recovered was largely burial material and the remains of a settlement and necropolis, evidence of people living and burying their dead here, rather than any instrument that would settle the observatory question one way or the other. Number 23. Mnajdra. On the southern coast of Malta, on a low rocky slope running down toward the sea, there's a cluster of stone temples looking out at the water. One of them faces east, out over the Mediterranean, and on the morning of the solstice, the first light of the rising sun comes straight through the doorway and strikes the edge of a standing stone deep inside the temple. On the equinoxes, the sunlight runs clean down the central passage. The stones are pale limestone, worn smooth by sea wind, standing on the cliffside above the waves. This is Mnajdra, a complex of 3 temples on Malta's south coast, built in the 4th millennium BC. The people who raised it were the same Maltese temple builders, working around 3600 to 3200 BC, long before writing came to the islands. Manasdra sits in a hollow near the cliff edge. 3 linked temples of rough coralline and softer Globigerina limestone, each made of curved chambers called apses, opening off a central corridor. The lower temple is the one that catches the sun, and its layout lines up with the movements of the year. That solar alignment is why some people call Manasdra a stone calendar. On the 2 equinoxes, the sunrise sends a beam straight down the main axis of the lower temple. On the summer and winter solstices, the light instead catches the edges of 2 stone slabs flanking the doorway, so the temple marks the turning points of the year by where the dawn light lands, working like a calendar built from sight lines and stone rather than paper. The precision is real, though how deliberately every alignment was planned is still discussed. The temple has porthole slabs, large stones with a rectangular opening cut through them, doorways carved as a hole in a single slab that a person passes through from one chamber to the next. In 2001, vandals broke into the site at night and toppled and damaged dozens of the ancient stones, cracking and dislodging megaliths that had stood for over 5,000 years, and conservators had to painstakingly repair and re-erect what had been knocked down. To shield the soft stone from further weathering, a protective tent-like canopy was later raised over Manasdra, so the temple that catches the solstice sun now stands beneath a shelter built to keep the rain off its 5,000-year-old stones. Number 24. Gunung Padang. On a hilltop in West Java, Indonesia, there are terraces of dark stone columns laid out across the slope, thousands of them, hexagonal blocks of basalt, stacked and arranged in steps up the hill. Local people have walked these terraces for generations, and Dutch surveyors noted the site back in the 1890s as a modest arrangement of stones. The columns are natural, long 6-sided rods of volcanic rock, and here they lie piled and stood on end across a series of stepped platforms climbing the ridge. This is Gunung Padang, a stone terrace site in West Java that became the center of one of the loudest arguments in recent archaeology. For most of its known history, it was treated as a fairly ordinary megalithic terrace site, the columnar basalt shaped by nature and used by people to build platforms. Then a geologist named Danny Natawijaja began drilling cores into the hill and running geophysical surveys, and he came out with an extraordinary claim that buried under the visible terraces lay hidden older structures, and that the oldest layers were built by human hands, many thousands of years ago, potentially making it far older than any known monument. Those dates are the whole fight. In 2023, Natawijaja and his co-authors published a paper arguing Gunung Padang was a buried pyramid, with construction going back tens of thousands of years, and the claim spread fast online. Other archaeologists and geologists objected strongly, arguing that the deep construction was most likely natural rock and soil, and that dating soil from a core doesn't tell you a human built anything at that depth. The core problem is telling apart natural columnar basalt, which forms in neat geometric shapes on its own when lava cools, from stone that people deliberately stacked, and the two can look alike underground. The pushback was serious enough that the publisher opened an investigation, and in 2024, the paper was retracted, with the journal concluding the dating evidence didn't support the claim that the deeper layers were human-made. A group of Indonesian archaeologists had also publicly opposed the excavation and its conclusions, so the site sits today with a retraction notice attached to its most famous paper, its terraces still climbing the hill in West Java, its real age and history still being worked out by researchers. Number 25. Archaim. In 1987, a survey team was flying over the steppe in the southern Ural region of Russia, mapping a valley that was about to be flooded for a reservoir. Looking down at the grassland, they saw a pattern in the earth that shouldn't have been there, a set of faint concentric rings pressed into the ground, a great circle with another circle inside it, laid out too regularly to be natural. On the ground it was almost invisible, From the air, it read like a target drawn on the plain. This is Arkaim, a Bronze Age settlement in the Russian steppe, uncovered right before it was due to vanish under a reservoir. The people who built it belonged to the Sintashta culture, a Bronze Age people of the steppe, who lived around 2000 BC, herders and metalworkers who left behind a string of fortified round settlements in the region. Archaeum is one of the best preserved, a circular town laid out as rings of dwellings, the houses built wall to wall in a ring around a central open space, with a second ring inside the first, and streets running between them, the whole thing enclosed by an outer wall of timber and earth. The plan is so tidy, it reads like a design drawn with a compass. The Sintashta are tied to some of the earliest known chariots. In burials of this culture, including sites near Archaeum, archaeologists have found the remains of spoke-wheeled chariots and horse gear, among the oldest chariot evidence anywhere. Inside the settlement, the houses held furnaces and traces of metalworking, so each home doubled as a small workshop. The people smelting bronze right there in the ring. Archaeum was found because it was about to be drowned. The valley had been marked for a reservoir, and the discovery kicked off a campaign to stop the flooding, which eventually succeeded. So the reservoir project was canceled, and the site was spared. Since then, Archaeum has picked up a second life as a magnet for mystics and nationalist mythmakers, who have spun it into all sorts of grand claims about ancient origins. Take those with a heavy grain of salt, because the archaeological record is a fortified herding town with furnaces and chariot burials, and that's what the excavations actually recovered. The reservoir was never built, and the ring town that was slated to disappear under the water still sits on the open steppe. Number 26, Skara Brae. In the winter of 1850, a fierce storm battered the west coast of Orkney, the cluster of islands off the northern tip of Scotland. The wind stripped the grass and sand off a large dune near the Bay of Scale, and when the weather cleared, the outlines of stone buildings lay exposed in the side of the dune, walls and rooms that had been buried under sand for thousands of years. Inside were houses with stone walls still standing, connected by low-covered passages, a whole village pulled out of the ground by a single storm. This is Skara Brae, a Neolithic village on Orkney, dated to around 3180 BC, older than Stonehenge and the pyramids. The people who lived here were farmers and fishers on the treeless Orkney Islands, and because they had almost no wood, they built nearly everything out of the flat local stone. 8 houses survive, clustered together and linked by roofed passageways, each one a single room with a hearth in the middle. And because they built in stone, the furniture survived, which almost never happens from this period. Inside each house stands a stone dresser against the far wall, a set of shelves facing the door, along with stone box beds built into the walls, and stone tanks set into the floor. So you can walk into a 5,000-year-old house and see where people kept their things, where they slept, and where they sat by the fire. The village even had plumbing of a kind. Drains run underneath the houses, stone-lined channels built into the floors, and some of the small cells built into the walls may have been early toilets connected to that drainage, carrying waste away from the homes. The site was excavated properly in the 1920s by the archaeologist Veer Gordon Child, who dug out the houses and studied the layout, helping establish just how old and how sophisticated this little stone village really was. The same sea that uncovered Skara Brae now threatens to take it, because the site sits right at the shore and the waves eat at the coast, so a seawall was built to hold the water back. But erosion keeps working at the edge of the bay, and the encroaching sea is once again closing in on the village it first revealed. Number 27, Ness of Brodgar. In 2003, a farmer was plowing a field in Orkney, the cluster of islands, off the northern tip of Scotland, when the plow turned up a large notched stone. The field sat on a thin strip of land between 2 of Orkney's famous stone circles, the stones of Stennis at one end and the ring of Brodgar at the other, and the notched slab hinted that something lay under the soil in the gap between them. When archaeologists began to dig, They found not a single building, but a dense complex of stone structures packed into the ground. This is the Ness of Brodgar, a Neolithic complex in Orkney, sitting on the neck of land between two great stone circles. The people who built it were the Neolithic farmers of Orkney, working around 3000 BC, the same culture that raised the circles on either side and lived in stone villages like Skara Brae nearby. What the excavations uncovered was a cluster of large buildings with thick stone walls, built and rebuilt over centuries. So many structures crowded together that the site reads as a kind of monumental precinct rather than an ordinary settlement. One of the largest, known as Structure 10, had walls several meters thick and a floor space bigger than any Neolithic building found before it in the region. Some of the stones carried decoration. The builders cut patterns into slabs, and in places traces of pigment survived. So archaeologists found painted stones, walls colored with reds and yellows made from ground minerals, evidence that these buildings were decorated rather than left as bare gray stone. The site seems to have ended with a feast. In the layers marking the closing of the complex, excavators found the bones of hundreds of cattle, a huge deposit of animal remains, red as the remains of an enormous feast held as the buildings were deliberately decommissioned, a single great gathering to mark the end of the place. After many seasons of digging, the archaeologists made an unusual decision. Rather than leave the fragile structures exposed to the harsh Orkney weather, in 2024 they backfilled the site, covering the excavated buildings with protective layers to preserve them under the ground. So the Ness of Brodgar, after 2 decades of careful excavation, was deliberately reburied, sealed back under the soil between the two stone circles where the plow first struck it. Number 28, Sachin Bajo. On the dry coastal plain of Peru, in the Casma Valley, archaeologists digging into a low mound uncovered a circular plaza sunk into the ground. A round, sunken court ringed by stone walls, built and then buried and built over again. The plaza is modest in size, a bowl of stone set below the surrounding surface, reached by stairs, the kind of gathering place where people came down out of the flat desert light into an enclosed round space. Around it, the excavators found layer upon layer of earlier and later construction stacked on the same spot. This is Sachin Bajo, an early monumental site on the Peruvian coast, with parts of it dated to around 3500 BC. The work here was carried out by German and Peruvian archaeologists, and what makes the site matter is its age, because the sunken plaza is among the oldest known pieces of monumental architecture in the Americas, built by people on the coast long before pottery was common in the region. These were communities living off the rich Pacific fisheries and early farming, raising communal stone structures thousands of years ago. The key to reading Sachin Bajo is superposition, the simple principle that when people build on the same spot over and over, the older construction ends up on the bottom and the newer on top. So digging down is like moving back through time. At Sachin Bajo, the excavators found plaza built over plaza, phase stacked on phase, and it was the deepest, oldest layers that gave the very early dates, showing people had been raising architecture here far earlier than expected. Not far off, at a related site called Cerro Sachin, stone slabs stand carved with stark images of warriors and dismembered bodies, rows of engraved figures that give the wider Sachin complex its grim reputation. What Sachin Bajo really offers is that deep, vertical record, the stack of building layers cut through in the excavation profile, each one a chapter of construction laid down on the one before, running back to the beginnings of monument building on the Peruvian coast. Number 29, Corral. In a dry river valley on the coast of Peru, a couple of hours inland from the Pacific, 6 earthen pyramids rise out of the desert, flat-topped mounds of stone and rubble stepped up toward the sky. Around them sit the outlines of sunken circular plazas, piled walls, and residential quarters, a whole city laid out on the sand. And in all of it, dug through floor after floor, the archaeologists found no pottery, not a single shard. This is Caral, a city in Peru's Supe Valley, dated to around 2600 BC, roughly the age of the Egyptian pyramids. The person who put Caral on the map was a Peruvian archaeologist named Ruth Shady, who began serious excavation there in the 1990s. She was digging a site in the coastal desert that earlier surveyors had walked past, and the deeper she went, the older it looked. The absence of pottery was the first strange thing, because pottery is usually a marker that a settled, complex society has arrived. And here was a city with monumental pyramids and no pots at all, meaning it was built by people who hadn't started making ceramics yet. So Corral pushed the rise of complex society in the Americas back much earlier than many had thought, into a pre-ceramic age. The way the pyramids were built explains how they've lasted. The corral builders filled woven bags with stones, bags made of plant fiber called shikra, and stacked these loaded bags inside retaining walls to form the core of each mound, like filling a gabion cage with rock. Piling up bagged rubble this way gave the mounds enough give to ride out the earthquakes that shake this coast, and it left a lot of organic plant fiber built right into the structure. That fiber is how the site got its dates. Radiocarbon dating measures the slow decay of carbon in once living material, and the reed bags woven from plants gave the excavators clean organic material to test, which returned the dates placing Corral around 2600 BC. A knotted cord device called a quipu, the kind of counting and record-keeping tool later used by the Inca, was also found at the site, suggesting the technology reaches back far earlier than the Inca era. Across the whole city, the excavators found no fortifications, no defensive walls, and no cache of weapons, pointing to a society that wasn't organized primarily around warfare. Ruth Shady's work at Corral came with fights over funding and control of the site, and in 2003, she was attacked by people connected to a land dispute over the ruins, shot and wounded while defending the excavation she had spent years building. Number 30. Nabta Playa. Deep in the Egyptian Sahara, far to the west of the Nile, there's a ring of stones standing in the sand hundreds of kilometers from any river. The desert here is some of the driest land on Earth, empty and flat to the horizon, and yet a small circle of upright slabs stands in the dust, with some stones set to mark lines across the open ground. There's nothing around it now, no water, no settlement, just sand, and the low stones catching the sun. This is Nabta Playa, a prehistoric stone circle in the Egyptian desert, older than Stonehenge. The desert wasn't always empty. Thousands of years ago, this part of the Sahara went through wetter periods when seasonal rains filled shallow lakes called playas and drew herders and their cattle out into what is now barren sand. An American archaeologist named Fred Wendorf surveyed the region starting in the 1970s and found traces of these cattle-herding people who camped by the seasonal lake and left behind the stone circle and other monuments on its shores. The circle itself is small but carefully placed. Several of its stones are set so that sight lines run between them toward points on the horizon, and researchers have argued the arrangement worked as a calendar, marking the direction of the sunrise around the summer solstice, the time of year when the rains would come, so the herders may have been tracking the season that filled their lake. The stones sat on the edge of that vanished paleolake, a marker on the shore of water that's been gone for thousands of years. These people took their cattle seriously, even in death. Under stone-covered mounds nearby, called tumuli, the excavators found cattle deliberately buried, whole animals placed in pits and covered over, suggesting the herds held a sacred place in the lives and beliefs of the people who kept them. To build the site, they hauled large sandstone slabs across kilometers of ground to the lakeshore, moving multi-ton stones out to the empty flat where the circle and its alignments were raised. The original stones were eventually lifted out of the desert and moved for protection, relocated to a museum in Cairo, so they wouldn't be lost or damaged out in the open sand. In their place, out at the site where the herders once watched for the solstice sun, a replica of the circle now stands on the shore of the lake that dried up long ago. Number 31. Dolmen of Soto. In a field in the province of Huelva, in southwestern Spain, there's a long, low mound of earth, and cut into the side of it runs a corridor of standing stone slabs, leading down into the dark. The passage stretches around 21 meters into the mound, lined on both sides by upright stones that grow taller as you move inward, roofed with capstones, ending in a chamber deep inside the earth. The slabs are granite and sandstone, set on edge, and the corridor runs straight toward the point on the horizon where the sun comes up. This is the Dolmen of Soto, a passage tomb in Huelva, built around 3000 BC. The people who raised it were Neolithic farmers of the Iberian Southwest, part of the same broad wave of tomb building that ran across Atlantic Europe. A landowner found the mound in 1922, and excavation opened up the buried corridor, revealing a passage tomb of a scale unusual for the region, one of the largest in Iberia. The builders graded the stones by height along the corridor. The uprights lining the passage start lower at the entrance and rise as the corridor runs inward, so the roof climbs as you move toward the chamber, the whole passage swelling in height on the way to its deepest point rather than running flat. It's a deliberate bit of staging built into the stonework, the tomb growing taller around whoever walked its length. The corridor is aligned to the sunrise, set so that light from the rising sun on certain days runs straight down the passage and into the chamber, the same trick of orientation found in passage tombs across Atlantic Europe. Many of the corridor stones turned out to be carved. A 2019 study went over the uprights using raking light, a technique where light is shone across a stone's surface at a low angle so that shallow worn engravings throw small shadows and become visible, the way late afternoon sun picks out faint lettering on a weathered gravestone. Under that angled light, the researchers identified engravings on a large number of the corridor's stones, images and marks cut into the slabs that had gone unnoticed before, bringing the count of decorated stones in the passage into the dozens. Number 32, Rujum El Hiri. On the Golan Heights, a windswept plateau of black volcanic rock, there's a set of stone rings laid out on the ground, circles inside circles, built from thousands of tons of loose basalt. From the ground, it looks like a low, rubbly field of rock. From the air, it resolves into a clear target-shaped pattern, several concentric rings with a stone cairn at the dead center, the whole thing spanning over 100 meters across. It was spotted this way, from above, during an aerial survey in 1968. This is Rujum El Hiri, a set of concentric basalt rings on the Golan Heights, built from roughly 42,000 tons of stone. The people who raised it worked here thousands of years ago, in the Bronze Age or earlier, stacking loose basalt cobbles into walls that formed the rings. Basalt is the black volcanic rock that covers the Golan, and there was plenty of it lying around to be gathered and piled, which is part of how such a massive tonnage of stone got moved without any of it being quarried or shaped. The rings connect to each other in places with short radial walls, dividing the space into segments. At the center sits a stone cairn, a mounded pile of rock, and that cairn appears to have been added later than the rings around it, with a burial chamber built into it, so the monument was reused as a tomb at some point after the rings first went up. For a long time, the rings were read as an astronomical instrument, with gaps in the outer walls, said to line up with the sunrise on the solstice, so people described it as a kind of ancient calendar in stone. A 2024 geophysics study pushed back on that reading, arguing that the ground beneath the Golan has slowly rotated over the millennia due to tectonic movement, so the walls have shifted from wherever they originally pointed, which would undercut any claim that the current alignments were designed to catch a particular sunrise. The astronomical debate is very much still open. The site carries a local name, in Arabic, Rujum El Hiri, meaning the stone heap of the wildcat, and a Hebrew name, Gilgal Rephaim. The Wheel of Giants, the giant builders of local legend, once again pressed into service to explain stones that seem too heavy for ordinary hands. Number 33, Great Zimbabwe, in the grasslands of southern Africa, in the country that took its name from this place. There are walls of gray granite rising up to 11 meters high, built entirely without mortar. The stones cut and stacked so precisely that they've held for centuries, with nothing binding them but their own weight and fit. The walls curve and flow across the hillside and the valley below, enclosing spaces where a great town once stood, and along the top of one wall runs a decorative band of stones laid in a chevron pattern, a zigzag worked into the masonry. This is Great Zimbabwe, a stone city in southern Africa, built between roughly the 11th and 15th centuries. The people who built it were the ancestors of the Shona, Bantu-speaking Africans who raised this city as the capital of a wealthy state that grew rich on cattle and on trade in gold and ivory, sending goods all the way to the coast to be traded across the Indian Ocean. At its height, it was home to many thousands of people, and the word Zimbabwe comes from a Shona phrase, meaning houses of stone. When European colonizers arrived and saw the ruins, many of them refused to believe Africans had built it. Convinced the stonework must be the work of some outside civilization, they spun theories that Phoenicians or the biblical Queen of Sheba had raised the city. In 1905, an archaeologist named David Randall McIver examined the site and concluded it was African in origin and medieval in date. And in 1929, another archaeologist, Gertrude Caton Thompson, confirmed it firmly, showing the city was built by Africans, but that finding was politically inconvenient for the white minority government that later ruled the country, and the colonial regime pressured against the African origin conclusion, even leaning on guidebooks and museums to muddy it, because an African-built city undercut the story they told to justify their rule. The building style is dry stone masonry, granite split into even blocks, and laid in level courses without any mortar. The walls built thick and battered, so they lean slightly inward for stability, topped in places with that chevron decoration. Among the finds were carved soapstone birds, distinctive figures perched on columns that likely stood atop the walls, and these became emblems of the city. Several of them were taken away during the colonial period and scattered to museums and private hands. One of those birds had a broken piece that ended up in Germany, and in recent years, the fragment was returned to Zimbabwe, reuniting part of a soapstone bird carried off long ago with the rest of the figure it was broken from. Number 34. Adam's Calendar. On an escarpment in the Mpumalanga region of South Africa, high ground, looking out over a wide green valley, there's an arrangement of standing stones set upright in the grass. A few large stones stand at the center, with others placed around them, and the site sits among a much wider spread of old stone-walled ruins that run for kilometers across these hills. Claims have circulated online that this stone arrangement is tens of thousands of years old, older than any known monument on Earth. This is the site some call Adam's Calendar, a stone arrangement in Mpumalanga, and the extraordinary age claims made for it have not held up to archaeological testing. The claims came largely from popular writers rather than field archaeologists, and they put the site's age at anywhere from 75,000 to hundreds of thousands of years, tied to ideas about lost advanced civilizations. Archaeologists who have looked at the evidence find no dating that supports those figures. Dating a plain arrangement of standing stones is genuinely hard because bare rock carries no built-in clock the way organic material does. So in the absence of datable material underneath or associated with the stones, an enormous age can be asserted but not demonstrated. Treat the dramatic numbers as unsupported claims rather than findings. The land around the stones holds something real and well documented, though. Spread across these hills are the Bokoni stone ruins, an extensive network of dry stone walls, terraces, homesteads, and linked roadways built by farming communities, dated to roughly the last several centuries. These were working agricultural settlements, with the stone walls enclosing fields and cattle, and they've been mapped and studied by archaeologists as a serious record of southern African farming life. So the surrounding landscape matters on its own terms, as the remains of a large, organized farming society that terraced these hills and moved between walled homesteads, whatever one makes of the single stone arrangement at its edge. And the peer-reviewed surveys of the region record the Bokoni terraces and homesteads dated to recent centuries, with no evidence for the ancient stone calendar the popular claims describe. Number 35. Alice Stones. On a grassy cliff above the Baltic Sea, near the village of Koseberga in southern Sweden, 59 large boulders are set upright in the outline of a ship. The stones trace a long, pointed oval, wide in the middle and tapering at both ends, with two taller stones marking the bow and the stern. So from above, the whole thing reads as the hull of a vessel drawn on the clifftop in stone. The sea lies just beyond the edge, gray and open, and the stones stand against the sky, with the water behind them. This is Alice Stones, a stone ship in southern Sweden, roughly 67 meters long from end to end. The people who raised it worked here well over 1,000 years ago, with dating estimates, placing the monument in the Iron Age, in the centuries before the Viking era. The stone ship is a form found across Scandinavia, an outline of standing stones laid out in the shape of a boat, and these settings were often tied to burial, the ship marking a grave or serving as a monument to the dead. Excavations at Alice Stones have turned up traces connected to burial, though the exact function is still worked out from limited evidence. The stones themselves were brought from a distance. Some of the boulders are a type of rock sourced from kilometers away, hauled to the clifftop and set on end. So the builders didn't simply use whatever lay at hand, but moved specific stones to the site to complete the ship's outline. The monument has drawn astronomical claims, with some arguing that the bow and stern stones line up with the sunrise and sunset at the solstices, framing the turning points of the year. Other researchers are more cautious, pointing out that a long oval of stones will line up with plenty of horizon points by chance, so the solstice claims stay debated rather than settled. And inside the outline of the ship, excavation recovered burnt material and traces linked to a grave, the physical remains that tie this clifftop vessel of stone to the dead it was raised to mark. Number 36. Gochang Dolmens. On the hillsides and in the fields of Gochang, a county in southwestern South Korea, hundreds of large capstones sit propped on smaller supporting rocks, scattered across the landscape in one of the densest concentrations of these tombs anywhere. Some are big, flat boulders resting on low stones like tables. Others sit closer to the ground, and they run in clusters along the slopes, so many of them that a walk through the area means passing dolmen after dolmen, the gray stones dotting the green. This is the Gochang Dolmen Field, part of a Korean concentration of megalithic tombs, so large that the peninsula holds a big share of all the dolmens in the world. The people who built them lived on the Korean peninsula in the 1st and 2nd millennia BC. And for reasons still worked out by archaeologists, Korea ended up with an enormous number of these stone tombs, tens of thousands across the country, with Gochang holding one of the richest clusters. A dolmen here is a burial marker, a capstone raised over a grave, and Korean archaeologists sort them into types by how they are built. There's the table type, sometimes called the northern type, where tall, upright stones stand on the ground holding a capstone clear above, like a table. There's the go-board type, or southern type, where the capstone rests on low, squat, supporting stones close to the ground, named for its resemblance to the board used in the game of Go. And there are capstone types, where the great stone sits almost directly on the burial pit. Gochang has a striking run of them, with the Bugun-ri area holding a particularly dense line of tombs. Beneath some of these capstones, excavators have recovered bronze artifacts and pottery buried with the dead, grave goods that help date the tombs and show they marked real burials rather than standing empty. Korea's dolmens were recognized together on the world stage, with 3 sites, Gochang among them, alongside Hwasun and Ganghwa, inscribed as a group for holding many hundreds of these tombs concentrated in a small area, a density of megalithic burial found almost nowhere else. Number 37. Tomb of the Cyclops at Mycenae. On a rocky hill in the northeast of the Peloponnese, in southern Greece, a great gateway stands in a wall of massive stone blocks. Above the doorway sits a single stone lintel weighing around 20 tons, and above that, 2 carved lionesses, face each other across a column cut into a stone slab set into the wall. The blocks around the gate are enormous and roughly fitted, so large that later Greeks looking at them could not imagine ordinary people had stacked them. This is Mycenae, a Bronze Age citadel in Greece, and the classical Greeks believed its walls were built by the Cyclopes. The people who raised it were the Mycenaeans, the warrior culture that dominated Greece in the late Bronze Age, centuries before the classical age of Athens and Sparta. By the time the classical Greeks came along, Mycenae was already ancient ruins, and they looked at the huge unshaped blocks in its walls and decided no human crew could have lifted them, so they credited the one-eyed giants of their myths, the Cyclopes. The style of building even took its name from that story, called Cyclopean masonry, walls made of massive irregular boulders fitted together with smaller stones, jammed into the gaps rather than neatly squared blocks. A German businessman turned excavator named Heinrich Schliemann dug at Mycenae in 1876, chasing the world of Homer's poems, and he uncovered shaft graves inside the citadel filled with gold, including a gold death mask he famously, and wrongly, linked to the legendary king Agamemnon. The mask and the grave goods were real Bronze Age treasure, even if his romantic attributions did not survive later scrutiny. Nearby stands a structure that shows what these builders could do with a roof, the treasury of Atreus, a great domed tomb built into a hillside. Its chamber is roofed with a corbelled dome, courses of stone stacked in rings that step inward over each other until they close at the top, forming a tall, beehive-shaped vault. The same lean the stones inward method used at New Grange, scaled up into a huge stone dome, and that corbelled dome held the record as the largest of its kind in the world for over 1,000 years, until the Romans finally spanned a wider space with the Pantheon. Number 38. Almendres Cromlech. On a gentle slope among cork oak trees near Evora, in the Alentejo region of southern Portugal, close to 100 granite stones stand clustered together on the hillside. They're rounded, egg-shaped boulders, some waist-high and some taller than a person, set on end in overlapping rings and ovals across the slope. The site sat forgotten for a long time and was rediscovered in 1964, when a researcher surveying the area came across the stones half hidden among the trees. This is the Almendra Cromlech, a megalithic stone enclosure near Evora, built and rebuilt in phases starting around 6000 BC. The people who raised it were among the earliest stone builders of the Iberian Peninsula, working here long before Stonehenge, and they didn't put the whole thing up at once. The site was built in stages across many centuries, and excavation showed the layout shifted over time, starting as smaller circular settings of stones, and later being extended into larger, more oval-shaped enclosures. So the arrangement you see now is the sum of several building phases layered on the same slope. Some of the stones carry carvings. On a number of the granite boulders, there are engraved circles, wavy lines, and shepherd's crook shapes cut into the rock, worn faint by weathering but still visible on the surfaces, marks left by the people who set the stones in place. A short distance away stands a single tall stone on its own, the Menhir dos Almendres, a lone standing stone set apart from the main enclosure, and a line drawn between it and the stone rings points toward the sunrise around midsummer, one of the alignments researchers have proposed for the site. Excavation at Almendre identified several distinct construction phases in the enclosure. The stone rings raised, rearranged, and enlarged across the long stretch of centuries the site was in use. Number 39. Zagra Stone Circle. On the island of Gozo, just north of Malta, there's a field where, in 1820, a shaft dropped away into the ground and opened into a cave full of human bone. An artist and antiquarian named Otto Bayer recorded the site and had drawings made of what was found, a burial cave ringed at the surface by standing stones. Then the location was lost. The stones were cleared, the field went back to farming, and for around 140 years, nobody knew exactly where the circle had stood. This is the Zagra Stone Circle on Gozo, a Maltese temple period burial site rediscovered through old drawings. The people who used it were the temple builders of Malta and Gozo, the same culture that raised Gantaija nearby, and the circle worked as a place of the dead. A ring of standing stones marked the surface, and beneath it lay a natural cave system used for burial. So the monument paired an above-ground stone circle with an underground chamber packed with the remains of the community's dead. The site vanished from the record after Bayer's time, and the way it came back is a small piece of detective work. Researchers had Bayer's early 19th century drawings of the circle and the surrounding field, and in 1964, they used those old illustrations to work out where the lost site must have stood, matching the sketched landscape to the real one, and pinning down the location again after well over a century. When the cave was properly excavated, it turned out the roof had collapsed at some point in antiquity, sealing the burial deposit beneath fallen rock, and inside lay the remains of a very large number of people, one of the richest burial deposits of the Maltese temple period. Among the finds was a carved twin figurine, a small stone sculpture of two seated figures side by side, recovered from the burial deposit inside the cave. After the excavation, the Zagra circle was covered and protected, the fragile site sealed again to guard the remains beneath it. Number 40. Lepenski Vir. On a terrace above the Danube, where the river cuts through a dramatic gorge on the border between Serbia and Romania, archaeologists uncovered the floors of houses shaped like trapezoids, wide at the front and narrowing toward the back, laid out in a fan across the slope facing the water. Set into the floors were hearths, and around them stood carved boulders, some of them shaped into faces that are part human and part fish, staring out with round eyes and downturned mouths. The houses all open toward the river, toward the great whirlpool in the Danube below. This is Lepenski Vir, a prehistoric settlement on the Danube in Serbia, its main phases running back into the 7th and 6th millennia BC. The site was excavated by a Serbian archaeologist named Dragoslav Srejovic in the 1960s, and the timing was urgent because a huge dam was being built downstream at the Iron Gates Gorge, and the rising reservoir was going to drown the terrace. So the dig was a race against the water, uncovering a settlement of hunter-fishers who had lived along this stretch of the Danube for generations, fishing the rich waters where the river narrowed. The houses are the signature, with floors made of a hard, reddish limestone plaster, laid in that distinctive trapezoidal shape, with a hearth set into each one. And among the houses stood the sculptures, sandstone boulders carved with faces blending human and fish features, which many read as spirits or deities tied to the river that fed the community. Whether the people here were purely hunter-gatherers or were beginning to settle and shift toward farming has been debated, since the site sits right at the transition and shows an unexpectedly settled, organized community for hunter-fishers. Because the reservoir was going to flood the original terrace, the whole site was lifted and moved, the house floors and sculptures relocated uphill to a new position above the waterline, where they were reassembled under shelter. So Lepenski Vir today sits above its own original ground, raised out of the path of the Danube, the fish-faced sculptures still watching a river that now runs higher than it did when the houses were first laid down. Number 41. Talayots of Minorca. On the island of Minorca, in the Balearic Islands off the eastern coast of Spain, strange T-shaped stone monuments stand in the fields. Each is made of two great slabs, a tall upright stone with a second broad slab laid flat across its top, forming a giant letter T that rises above the surrounding scrub. Around them sit round stone towers and other structures of massive dry stone masonry, scattered across the island in the dozens. This is the Taliotic culture of Minorca, a Bronze Age society that covered the island in stone monuments, starting in the 2nd millennium BC. The people who built these worked here for centuries, raising several distinct kinds of stone structure that give the culture its vocabulary. The Talayot is a round stone tower, a solid or chambered mound of masonry that gives the culture its name. The Taula is the T-shaped monument, an upright slab capped by a horizontal one, usually standing inside a horseshoe-shaped enclosure. And the Navita is a stone tomb shaped like an upturned boat, built for burial. So the island holds a whole-built landscape of towers, T-stones, and boat-shaped graves, all in heavy dry stone construction. The Taula precincts appear to have been ritual spaces. Excavation in the enclosures around the T-stones has turned up deposits linked to ceremony, animal bone, and offerings, pointing to the Taula settings being used for gatherings and rites rather than as houses or tombs. In 2023, UNESCO added the Taliotic sites of Menorca to its World Heritage List, recognizing the island's dense concentration of these Bronze Age monuments. And across Menorca, hundreds of Taliotic structures still stand, the towers, taulas, and navetas surviving in the fields in numbers that make the small island one of the most monument-packed landscapes of the prehistoric Mediterranean. Number 42. Deer Stones of Mongolia. Out on the open grassland of northern Mongolia, tall slabs of granite stand upright in the steppe, carved with images of deer. The animals are cut in a flowing, stylized way, their bodies stretched long and their antlers swept back, shown leaping or flying up the face of the stone in rows. The slabs stand alone or in small groups on the rolling grass, with mountains in the distance and nothing else around for a long way. These are the deer stones of Mongolia, Bronze Age standing stones carved with flying deer, with over 1,000 recorded across the region. The people who raised them were the nomadic herders of the Mongolian steppe in the Bronze Age, and the carvings follow a surprisingly consistent set of rules. The deer are rendered in a distinctive style, elongated, with long-beaked snouts and great backward-flowing antlers, drawn again and again across many stones with the same conventions, so the imagery reads almost like a shared script. Below the deer, many stones are carved with a belt near the base, and beneath that, weapons like daggers and tools, as if the stone represents a figure girded for battle, the deer rising up its body. The stones stand near burial monuments. Close to many deer stones sit mounds called kirigzurs, stone burial structures ringed by smaller cairns, and excavation around them has turned up deposits of horse remains, particularly horse heads and hooves, buried in the surrounding satellite mounds. Those associated burials are how the stones get dated, since the deer stones themselves carry no built-in clock. So the organic material from the nearby graves and horse deposits anchors them in the Bronze Age. And across the Mongolian steppe, hundreds of deer stones still stand where they were raised, the flying deer carved up their faces looking out over the same open grassland the herders knew. Number 43, Kokino. On the summit of a hill in the north of North Macedonia in the Balkans, there's an outcrop of dark volcanic rock worked into seats and markers. Flat platforms and chair-like hollows are cut into the stone near the top, and along the rock edges are carved notches that frame points on the horizon where the sun and moon rise. The hill looks out over the surrounding country, and the site was found in 2001 during an archaeological survey of the area. This is Kokino, a Bronze Age site in North Macedonia carved into a volcanic hilltop. The people who used it worked here in the Bronze Age, and the site combines two things: a place of ritual and a place for watching the sky. Seat-like shapes are cut into the rock near the summit, thrones or platforms hollowed from the stone, and along the eastern edge of the outcrop are carved notches and markers that line up with the rising sun at key points of the year and with the moon at its extremes. The idea is that an observer standing at a fixed spot could watch the sun or moon come up over a particular notch on a particular day, using the carved rock as a set of natural sights, the way you'd line up a target through a notch on a gun. The dating comes from what was found on the terraces. Excavation on the hill recovered ceramics and other material that placed the site's use in the Bronze Age, tying the rock-cut markers to the people who left their pottery there. Kokino drew wide attention when it circulated on lists of ancient observatories linked to NASA, and it's worth being clear about what that was: a popularized ranking that spread online rather than a formal endorsement. so the NASA site label overstates a looser piece of publicity. And the finds recovered from the terraces at Kokino, the Bronze Age pottery and worked material, are what tie the carved seats and horizon markers to the hands that made them. Number 44. Cockno Stone. On the edge of a Scottish town near Glasgow, there's a large flat slab of rock lying at ground level, its surface covered in carved markings, dozens of round hollows, each ringed by carved circles, with grooves running between them. These are cup and ring marks, one of the densest collections of them anywhere in Britain, spread across a stone about 13 meters long. For decades, though, anyone going to look for it would have found nothing but grass, because the whole carved slab was buried on purpose. This is the Cockno Stone, a prehistoric carved rock near Clydebank in Scotland, marked with Bronze Age cup and ring designs. The carvings were recorded in 1887 by a local minister and naturalist named John Bruce, and the stone became known as a remarkable example of this kind of rock art. Cup and ring marks are a prehistoric carving tradition found across Britain, Ireland, and beyond. A cup-shaped hollow pecked into the rock, and then encircled by one or more carved rings, and nobody is certain what they meant, whether they were maps, ritual symbols, or something else entirely. Their distribution across the Atlantic edge of Europe is wide, and their meaning stays a genuine open question. By the 1960s, the Cockno Stone had a problem, because it sat in the open near a growing town, and people were walking on it, chipping at it, and covering it in modern graffiti. So in 1965, to protect it, archaeologists made the decision to bury the whole slab under earth, hiding it completely, and letting the soil shield the carvings from further harm. It stayed buried for about half a century. Then in 2016, a team re-excavated the stone, uncovering it again so it could be recorded with modern 3D scanning, capturing every hollow and ring in digital detail. When they exposed it, they found not only the ancient carvings, but also the modern graffiti and paint that had been sealed under the soil back in 1965, layered on top of the prehistoric marks. After the scanning was done and the stone had been fully recorded, it was covered back over again, reburied to keep it safe. So the Cockno Stone sits once more under the ground, protected and out of sight. Number 45. Hattusa's Sphinx Gate. On a high, rocky plateau in central Turkey, a stone rampart runs along a ridge, and cut through the base of it is a tunnel. The passage is roofed with stones leaned together into a peak, running under the earthen bank of the rampart and out the far side, so a person can walk straight through the fortification wall from below. Up above, the gate through the wall was once flanked by carved sphinxes, stone creatures with human heads, and lion bodies set to guard the entrance. This is Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire, and its Sphinx Gate sits atop a rampart with a stone tunnel running clean through it. The Hittites ran one of the great powers of the Bronze Age Near East, rivals to Egypt, and their capital at Hattusa was rediscovered along with a vast archive of clay tablets that recorded their laws, treaties, and letters, including correspondence with Egypt. So a lost empire that had faded into a few biblical mentions was brought fully back into history by the written record dug out of its own capital. The tunnel under the rampart is built by corbelling, the same lean the stones inward method seen elsewhere, with the passage roofed by stones tilted together until they meet at a peak overhead, running underneath the massive earthen bank of the defensive wall. This stretch of rampart, called Yer Kappa, is enormous, a great sloped bank faced in stone with the tunnel, the postern cutting through its base. One of the carved sphinxes from the gate spent much of the 20th century in Germany, taken abroad and displayed in a Berlin museum after early excavations. It was returned to Turkey in 2011, brought back to sit near the gate it was carved to guard. Number 46. Barnenez, on a headland in Brittany in northwest France. A long mound of stacked stone stretches across the promontory, stepped and terraced, looking out over the sea. One end of it is sheared clean off, cut away to expose the inside, so you can see straight into the layers and chambers within the mound. That cut face is the scar of a quarry, because in the 1950s, a contractor started tearing the mound apart for roadstone before anyone realized what it was. This is the cairn of Barnenez, a passage tomb mound in Brittany dated to around 4,800 BC, one of the oldest monuments in Europe. The people who raised it were among the earliest stone builders of Atlantic Europe, working here thousands of years before Stonehenge. The mound holds 11 separate chambers, each reached by its own passage running in from the edge, a whole row of tombs bundled into a single great cairn of dry stacked stone. The near destruction is how the inside came to be visible. In the 1950s, a contractor was quarrying the mound for stone to use in road building, hacking into one end of it, and the digging cut through the cairn and sliced open its passages before the work was stopped. So the tomb was nearly fed into a road, and the crews were partway through when the significance of what they were destroying became clear. That accidental cut left a cross-section that turned out to teach something. The exposed face showed the mound had been built in two phases, an older cairn with a newer one added onto it, the join between the two visible in the cut stone. So the vandalism revealed the tomb's construction history in a way an intact mound never would have. The French writer and culture minister André Malraux intervened to halt the quarrying and protect the site, and Barnenez was saved from the road builders partway through its own demolition. And that sliced open end is left visible today, the exposed cross-section of stacked stone showing the two phases of the cairn to anyone standing at the cut. Number 47. Cairn of Noth. In Ireland's Boyne Valley, near Newgrange, there's a great grassy mound with not one but two passages driven into it from opposite sides, each running deep toward the center of the cairn. A person entering from the east walks a long stone corridor toward the heart of the mound, and another passage runs in from the west to nearly meet it, so the mound is entered from two directions at once. Around the base runs a curb of large stones, and many of them are covered in carved designs, spirals, lozenges, and crescents pecked into the rock. This is Noth, a great passage tomb in the Boyne Valley, built around the same era as Newgrange, roughly 3,200 BC. The mound was excavated over many decades by an Irish archaeologist named George Yogan, whose long campaign of digging, running, from the 1960s onward, slowly revealed the structure of the cairn and the smaller tombs clustered around it. What he uncovered was a site of extraordinary richness, the main mound ringed by around 18 smaller satellite tombs, the whole complex used and reused across thousands of years. The two passages are Noth's signature. One runs in from the east and one from the west, the eastern passage being the longer of the two, ending in a cross-shaped chamber. And in that chamber sits a carved stone basin, a large-shaped bowl of stone that once likely held cremated remains. The two corridors nearly meet at the center but don't quite connect. Two separate tombs built into one mound back to back. What sets Noth apart, even from Newgrange, is the art. The curbstones and the stones lining the passages carry an enormous concentration of megalithic carving, and the site is estimated to hold a very large share of all the passage tomb art in Western Europe, a gallery of Neolithic engraving wrapped around and buried within a single mound. The mound didn't stop being used when the tomb builders were gone. In later ages, people returned to it, and the cairn saw reuse in the Iron Age and again in early medieval times, even serving as a fortified settlement, so Noth carries the marks of many different peoples layered onto the same great mound of Boyne Valley stone. Number 48. Bada Valley Megaliths. In the highland valleys of central Sulawesi, an island in Indonesia, large stone figures stand alone in the grassland. Some are carved into human forms, rounded faces with wide eyes and simple features cut into the stone, tilted at angles in the open fields with hills rising behind them. Others are great stone vats, hollowed cylinders of rock sitting in the grass. Hundreds of these stones are scattered across the valleys, standing where they've stood for a very long time. This is the Bada Valley, a landscape of megalithic stone figures in central Sulawesi. The people who carved them remain largely unknown, and the stones sit across several valleys in the highlands, a spread of standing figures and stone objects with no clear settlement obviously tied to them. The carved human figures are the most striking tall stones worked into faces and bodies, but there are also other forms scattered through the grass. Among them are the kalamba, large stone vats, hollowed cylinders of rock, some with separate stone lids, sitting in the fields near the figures. What they were for is uncertain, with burial among the leading suggestions, the vats possibly used to hold the dead, though the evidence is thin. Firm dating is hard to come by, and that's much of why the site stays mysterious. There's little organic material clearly associated with the standing stones to run through radiocarbon dating, and no written record, so the age of the Beta Valley figures is genuinely unsettled, rather than merely unknown, estimates ranging widely with little to pin them down. Local communities have their own names and traditions for individual figures, naming particular stones and carrying stories about them. And across the valleys of central Sulawesi, hundreds of these carved stones have been cataloged so far, the standing figures and stone vats recorded across the highland grassland. Number 49. Naveta des Tudons. In a field on the island of Minorca, in the Balearic Islands off eastern Spain, there's a stone structure shaped like an upturned boat. It sits low to the ground, built of large, dry-stacked slabs, with a rounded stern rising at one end, and the whole thing tapering toward the front, so it reads as the hull of a vessel flipped over and set down in the grass. A small, low doorway opens into the interior at the front. This is the Naveta des Tudons, a Bronze Age tomb on Minorca, one of the oldest roofed buildings in Europe. The people who built it were the Taliotic culture of Minorca, and the Naveta is their boat-shaped tomb, a burial structure of massive dry stone masonry raised for the dead. The word naveta comes from the boat shape, and this one is the best-known example on the island. It had collapsed over the centuries, and it was restored in the 1950s, the fallen slabs studied and rebuilt into the boat form it holds today. Inside, the tomb has two levels, an upper and a lower chamber stacked within the structure, and the dead were placed inside over a long span of use, so the naveta held the remains of many people across generations. The restoration in the 1950s recovered material from within, bones and grave goods left with the dead, finds that came out of the chambers as the collapsed structure was cleared and rebuilt. The site later had to be fenced off because so many visitors walking over and around it were wearing down the fragile stonework and the ground. And inside the two chambers of S. Tudons, the remains of around 100 individuals were recorded, the community's dead laid within the boat of stone across the long life of the tomb. Number 50. Stone Spheres of Costa Rica. In the 1930s, workers clearing dense jungle in the Diquís Delta of southern Costa Rica for banana plantations kept running into something strange in the ground. Stone balls, nearly perfect spheres of rock, some small enough to hold, and others taller than a person and weighing many tons. As the crews cut and burned the forest, more and more of them turned up, round stones sitting in the earth where no river or landslide could have shaped them, clearly made by human hands. These are the stone spheres of Costa Rica, hundreds of carved stone balls, left across the Diquís Delta by the people who lived there before the Spanish came. The spheres were made mostly from granodiorite, a hard igneous rock, quarried from sources in the hills, and then shaped and ground down into remarkably round balls, some of them accurate to within a small fraction of their diameter. The people who carved them belonged to societies living in the region in the centuries before European contact, and they seem to have arranged the spheres in deliberate groupings in front of the homes of important people, or in patterns that carried meaning now lost, because the culture that made them was largely destroyed after the Spanish arrived, and the knowledge of what they meant went with it. The Banana Company era was hard on the spheres. Crews rolled them out of the way, moved them onto lawns and into towns as ornaments, and worst of all, rumors spread that the balls had gold hidden inside, so treasure hunters drilled into them and blew some apart with dynamite, destroying spheres that had sat intact for centuries to find nothing but solid stone within. An American archaeologist named Doris Stone published the first serious study of the spheres in 1943, bringing them to scholarly attention and beginning the real work of documenting them before even more were moved or wrecked, because so many were shifted off their original spots, rolled onto lawns, and hauled into plazas. Only a small number of the spheres remain where their maker set them, in the arrangements that once carried meaning, and most now sit scattered far from the places they were meant to stand. And that's 50. Most of these sites are still only partly dug, their deeper layers sitting untouched under soil and sand, so the record isn't closed. It just goes quiet here for now.